What makes a successful language learner? In the following videos, 6 highly proficient language learners discuss what characteristics made them successful at language learning.
I think the main thing that motivated me to learn the language was wanting to be able to communicate with people. I mean, that's the basic, that's, the foundation, that's the basic reason for learning a language, really, is to communicate with other people in that language. I think that also helped me to remain motivated to keep learning, is because I continually was faced with the knowledge and the realization and awareness of how little I knew in order to be able to speak to someone in their language. I think that's a big difference between when you learn a language in your own, you learn a foreign language, but on your home front. You're not faced with that realization every day of how little you know, because you're not trying to order fruit at the market, and you're not trying to buy a ticket on the bus and stuff like that. So yeah.
Well, my parents were missionaries, and so I remember asking my mom, what can you say, what advice do you have to give to me before I go to the Philippines? And she said, learn the language well, go hard after it, because if you don't, you will never become close friends with them, and you'll get lonely, and you'll want to return to the States. And so that was good advice, but also it was I wanted to change people's hearts. And if they were, if I was asking them to give up everything to follow him, I needed to realize how painful and what a high cost that was. And so I needed to speak their heart language, because I was asking them to make a heart decision. So I wanted to be able to respond to their places of pain when they would speak. And when people are speaking out of their pain, they're speaking out of their heart. They want to use their heart language. And that's the moment when they're ready and vulnerable, and they're open to a word of encouragement, a word of hope, that there's a better way in life, turn your life over to Jesus. And so to be able to speak it in the language that they're speaking out of their pain in is so important. Like, for instance, I was in the country for about 10 months when I was talking with someone who had come to our house, and she was just, normally when she'd come to our house, we managed back and forth, her little English, my little Ilocano, we could make it happen. This time, she was just crying. I could not understand what she was saying, and I said, can you say it slower? I'm sorry, I know you're in a lot of pain. And so she would slow it way down. Something about her husband and her had a misunderstanding the night before. I determined right then and there, I needed to learn this language so that I could understand it even when people were crying. Because when they were crying, they were showing their pain. And I needed to be able to she was ready for a word of hope, a word of counsel, but how could I do it? Was I ready? That was the question. I wasn't yet, but I determined I would be.
Well, what motivated me was very simply that my wife and I had a call to come to France. We knew that France was where we belonged initially, from the beginning. So we were very motivated to learn the language, knowing that it was probably a lifetime call. At the time of Bethany, when we were called, we had a lifetime commitment, which changed a number of years in. But it was knowing that we were going to be here for a long time that really motivated us.
I think for me the main motivation was the fact that I could not do my job if I did not know the language. So the thing that motivated me was the vision that the Lord gave us was not going to be fulfilled if I didn't learn Ilocano. So that simply meant I had to continue to learn Ilocano. There was not an end to it. So I always could get better, with the idea that the better I get, the more effective I'd be.
For me, it's about the people. So being able to communicate with the people, just being here, moving around, going to the market. My desire to learn language was to be able to communicate with the people.
Well, I always enjoyed language. My best marks in junior high school and high school were in English. I always got my best grades there and enjoyed it the most. And I enjoyed writing. I sometimes would write little poems that would make people laugh. And so language has always been sort of an aptitude of mine that I have over other ones, like don't ask me to do any math equations or anything. So then, but I also like to be in contact with people. My kids, even today, they get embarrassed when we go to the supermarket and I just walk up to somebody that I think speaks another language, and all of a sudden we'll be talking and they said, "Dad, you didn't even know that person." But I love to communicate with people. And interestingly, after I came back from Brazil and noticed that there were a lot of Latins around here in the Minnesota area, my conclusion was that the Latins feel invisible here. People see them, but they don't pay any attention to them. And so I used to say that, you know, I think they feel invisible, and so I made a point of speaking every time I could with whatever Latin person was around, and it was always fun. Later on, I saw a movie, Made in Manhattan, with Jennifer Lopez, and I said Lopez, she probably says it Lopez, but in that movie she said, "You know, we Latins feel invisible." I thought, wow, she just confirmed what I've been saying for years. But then she added something. She said, "We feel invisible and we feel stereotyped," as though people think we're all alike. And I don't know, I just am drawn to people who speak foreign languages.
Some years later, after I did know the language, I was attending a PTA meeting for my children where they went to a Filipino private school. And the PTA president was giving his farewell speech. He was quitting his job because word on the street was he had been offended. So when he got up to speak, he started out his introduction. It was flawless English. He had studied at the he had worked for the US Navy, so he was an educated man. But when he got near to the story part where he had been offended, and I knew it was coming, he switched to Tagalog, which is the national language. I only knew market Tagalog. I didn't know it well. And so I turned to the other mother next to me and I said, "Can you translate for me?" And so she did. She translated into English for me. But then when he got to the nitty-gritty of the story, where that person had said something really hurtful and painful and he had felt betrayed, he switched to Ilocano, which evidently was his heart language. And I understood again. And the lady next to me, who didn't know Ilocano, said, "Please translate for me." So I translated from Ilocano into English for this Filipino lady next to me, because that man wanted to speak his pain and his anger in his heart language. That's how it came out best. So I wanted to be able to learn how to respond to those situations.
The more effective you are in the use of the language, the greater your ministry can be. I mean, let's just put something hypothetical out here, but say you've got a problem and you need to tell somebody. And you think there are two people there, and one of them speaks your language fairly well, but you know, not too well. The other one speaks it very well. Who are you going to talk to? Well, you may be thinking this way. Oh, he speaks the language, but not very well. I don't know if he's going to understand what I have to say. But I know that the other guy, he will understand it because he speaks the language well. And so you will find that people opening up more to you when you speak the language well than if you don't. Also, your language acquisition can take you places you never dreamed you would go. I remember after I'd been in Brazil for some time, the mission asked me to go down to Argentina and work out some kind of a problem. Well, I spoke Portuguese and I knew a little Spanish, but I was able to communicate with the people in Argentina and was able to resolve the problem. Then later on, we had a group of Brazilian people who called themselves theologians. They went to a theological conference up in Lima, Peru. Now in that group, there were 42 people coming from Brazil. 40 of them were Brazilians. 2 of them were Americans. I was one of the Americans, and it was because I spoke the language well. On another occasion, Franklin Graham came to Brazil to do a crusade. They asked me to be his interpreter. And it was a wonderful experience to spend 4 days alongside of him repeating everything he said in Portuguese. And it was a great experience. Later on, I went to Amsterdam to be an interpreter for a great big conference on evangelism. And I got to be one of the interpreters there. And later on, after that, 10 years later, the same thing in South Africa. And so the greater your language ability, I think the more opportunities you have to minister. If you want to go minister and preach in somebody's church, if you don't speak the language well, you might not get the invitation. If you speak it well, you might get it.